Professor Viviane Robinson, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for having a conversation with me. It's lovely to talk to you again. How have you been?
I've been fine and enjoying a lovely combination of work and recreation. So,
Amazing. You
yeah,
look refreshed, and you mentioned it's a little bit calmer your side this time of the year, but you look
yes,
relaxed.
yeah. Been able to do some of my favorite things like tramping in the South Island. That's
Oh,
been
love it.
wonderful.
About a year ago, we just got back, my family and I, from a cruise around New Zealand, and it is breathtakingly beautiful. I was ready to pack my bags up and move, but yeah, it didn't happen. But what a beautiful part of the world to live in. Vivian, I do want to be, I just want to jump straight into it because there is no way we could possibly talk about your extensive work in the short time we have today. But I really wanted our focus today to be on your amazing book, Student-Centered Leadership. And I'm just interested, before we get started, what drove you to focus your career on school leadership? Was there a particular catalyst or reason for that?
Possibly because, like many teachers, I come from a family of teachers.
Right.
Uh, my father was a primary school principal. He was the founding principal of a new Auckland primary school, and my mother was a secondary school teacher. My uncle was a teacher in a rural country school where most of the enrolled students were his own children. And so, I've grown up with teaching all my life. And then I got my doctorate on aspects of leadership. Um, I did my doctorate actually in leadership in clinical psychiatric hospitals, and then moved towards educational leadership quite gradually. So I was doing other sorts of leadership first and then moved towards educational leadership, partly because of that notion of serving society and serving students that came, I suppose, from my family.
I love that. It's funny how the amount of people I've spoken to that grew up in families of teachers who ended
Yeah,
up kind of initially
yeah.
inevitably moving into that space, but that's really wonderful to hear. Vivian, you've written extensively about student-centered leadership. What do you think leaders most often misunderstand about what it requires?
Well, I think that perhaps the hardest thing for leaders to get their head around is that the primary purpose of their work is to serve students. And sometimes that is in tension with serving adults.
Right.
And so, you've got the teacher, the upset teacher in your office who's got 1,001 reasons for being late many days, missing meetings, starting not being there with things ready for starting class, and apparently got good reasons for being late, chronic health problems, chronic family problems. Well, that's a classic case of the tension between being student-centered and being adult-centered, and it's so easy to respond to the person who's in your office and who's going to get very upset and has staff support from some staff members, lots of sympathy and on and yet to have to in that context think about what is happening to the students of that teacher, that is hard. And of course the ideal is that you serve both, but often that requires you to navigate the fact that you can't do exactly what that teacher wants.
It's really difficult, Vivian. And as I mentioned before we hit record, I've been doing my role for about 8 years. And it's something that I've really had to focus on is holding that tension between being sympathetic to people's challenges, but also reframing every decision that we make in the best interest of the students.
Yes.
It's really hard because we are, as teachers, or we should be a compassionate bunch and we want to solve people's problems. But sometimes the
Yeah.
student needs, I think, maybe get mixed up in that. Sorry, you were saying?
Yes. And it's even harder now because we're in a leadership and teacher culture where policymakers have decided that you are responsible for the stress levels of your staff. And so you have this real culture where being adult-centered rather than student-centered is is a pressure, an increased pressure.
Mm.
I mean, you're going to get into trouble in terms of a grievance laid against you by a teacher. You're not going to get into the same sort of trouble because there are a group of students who are consistently failing in a particular teacher's class.
It seems like somehow we've got that round the wrong way. Would you agree? The priorities
Yes,
there.
yes, I
Yeah.
think we have. We have got that round the wrong way. Is that accurate in your view?
Well, I think Vivian, and just I can only speak on behalf of the context that I work in, but it has become incredibly complicated. And
Yeah,
so I think one of the things that I've had to learn these last couple of years is to really refocus on what's in the best interest of the students, because there
yeah,
is so much noise. I mean, I could be asked 15 or 20 really important questions by the time I put my bag down and make a cup of tea in the morning. And that is really challenging. And quite often those questions are not student questions. They're because the students haven't arrived yet.
yeah,
It tends to be a staffing problem. And I think you're right. I think maybe this is me maturing in my leadership a little bit more. I mean, I have the privilege of working with some just phenomenal educators and an incredible school. But we are, and I feel really supported to be able to make that shift and ask what's in the best interest of our kids. But it is incredibly complicated. And I remember the first time I stepped into a leadership role 8 years ago, I was promoted because I was good in the classroom. But really, my role now has so much more to do than just being in the classroom. It is
yeah,
staff, supporting parents, implementing policy. It's that sort of classical middle leadership role where you feel like you're pulled in many directions. And
yeah,
so I always joke, I got promoted because of my competency in the classroom, but it really isn't a promotion, it's a career change. When you're moving into a middle leadership role and a principal role, it is a changing career. And so my constant challenge is to look through that lens noise. I
mm,
mean, what do you think then, Vivian, as we're sort of looking at some of those solutions? I mean, you have talked extensively about capabilities. So what are some of the capabilities do you think school leaders need to be effective? We've maybe touched on a few, but are there any others?
yeah. Well, I want to make this as simple as possible in
Mm.
terms of the way it's described. It's not
Yeah.
simple to
Yeah.
actually practice, but the way it's described. We do not need a huge list of leadership capabilities. If you get a committee together to write a leadership framework, you'll end up with a huge list. I've written in student-centered leadership, you need three
Mm.
capabilities: the ability to use your educational knowledge, and I want to talk some more later about educational knowledge, to
Sure.
use your educational knowledge to solve complex problems. That's the improvement part of your leadership role while building relational trust. And the conjunctions there and while are really important because leadership is the integration of those three things.
Great point.
Most leaders are terrific at building trust. It just becomes incredibly difficult when you're building trust, when you're trying to build trust, when you're talking to teachers about the need to improve some results, or
Mm.
you're talking to them about some aspect of their behavior or performance. So it's the integration of the complex problem solving, which is the improvement work, with the relational work that's hard. But
Mm.
those are the three capabilities you need. You need increasing amounts of educational knowledge, and New South Wales is on a push around that at the moment in terms of explicit teaching, and using, but not just having the knowledge, using it in solving complex problems of student achievement and learning while building trust with the adults.
Which sounds easy, doesn't it?
Yeah,
It sounds like yes, of course, but one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to your work, and I have been for many years, is because it's so relatable and it's really easy to read and go, okay, that's here are some of the things that I can do in my
yeah,
classroom tomorrow. I think I've read so many books by people that don't have that experience and are just
yeah,
speaking into what they think schools are like. But you can tell through your work that you have a deep understanding of some of the challenges that teachers are going through. I mean, you mentioned the importance before of educational knowledge. Why is that central?
well,
Sounds obvious, but why?
yeah, well,
Yeah.
I've been coaching several hundred school leaders um, across Australia, about 100 of whom are in New South Wales.
I feel like you're always in New South Wales. It's like your second home. Sorry,
And
you were saying.
I'm coaching them in school improvement and a model of school improvement. And the focus of the work is on a priority student outcome that they have selected.
Mm.
So this is context specific, grounded in student outcomes. So there's the student-centered nature of it. Right. Let's say there's a problem about our maths fluency results are good, but our maths problem-solving results are very poor. They can't do word problems. Okay. Now, you're a leader and your job is to try and improve that. Now, let's say if you don't have much knowledge about how to teach maths problem solving with word problems, like me, I don't have much. I go into that classroom. Do I know what to look for in terms of studying the teacher's current practices? So in terms of any causal analysis of what is the relationship between how these teachers are teaching maths and the outcomes for their students, I don't know enough to even know what to look for. Then when I've got and if I get some help with that, then I need to know what good practice looks like. And I don't know enough about the teaching of maths to deal with that either. So that's just one example. Another very current example in New South Wales is the leaders are being tasked now with introducing explicit teaching, which is much more than, of course, as you know, teaching phonics. And many leaders will have to navigate staff discussions, if not arguments, about whether they need to adopt explicit teaching, whether or not they're already doing it, whether it applies to their subject as opposed to English, maths, and science. Why do we need to do this? My kids are working fine. Navigating all those arguments requires you to know quite a lot about what explicit teaching is, what it isn't, and how to navigate those misunderstandings. That's another example of leaders needing quite a lot of pedagogical knowledge. Not only the pedagogy, but actually some of the principles behind it, like, oh, it's the latest fashion, or oh, there's nothing new about explicit teaching, or, whatever objections come up in the staff meeting.
I love that, Vivian. And one of the things that springs to mind is a conversation I was having with my wife about conscious incompetence. And I think it's important. There are so many things that I know I'm terrible at. I mean, if our house needs renovations, don't ask me, get somebody else to do it. I know that I don't know how to do that. But I
Yeah.
think there's so many things that we don't know that we're incompetent at. So I think it's
Yes.
really important to have that level of self-reflection and self-awareness to say, okay, if I'm going to be
Yeah.
leading people through this, I
Yeah.
need to have deep educational knowledge to be able to do that.
Yes. Yes. And of course, and if you're a leader of a large school, then you can't actually get that knowledge and in sufficient depth across, and it would be a really inappropriate expectation to get in sufficient depth across all learning areas. But leaders need sufficient knowledge to know whether the people they've delegated it to are actually themselves sufficiently knowledgeable. So, for example, let's
Good
say
point.
you've got an inquiry-based, project-based form of pedagogy going on in your part of your school. All right. Now, you need to know enough to know that there is quite a lot of evidence suggesting that such approaches are not effective. Notice I'm not saying it's not effective in your school. I'm saying you need to know enough to know
Yeah.
that minimal instructional guidance and asking students to do projects, inquire independently when they're novices in a topic, there's a lot of evidence that's ineffective. Now, for principals who have teachers who are passionate about inquiry-based learning, they want to be supportive of the adults, but do they know enough to know that might be a really problematic instructional practice and that they need to test that by looking carefully at the results for the kids. So the adult-centeredness is the teachers are confident and they love it. The student-centeredness is I better check, despite their confidence, despite their passion, my job is to look at the results for those students.
Wow. It's so I think what you're saying is so important to us school leaders. It's about removing so much of the noise around us and just focusing on what
Yeah.
is best for our kids. And once again, that sounds so easy to do, but it is incredibly challenging. Vivian, I was really drawn to your work around um, classroom observations. Would
Yeah.
you mind maybe unpacking? It seems like a nice link to what you're talking about before. What separates observations that lead to learning from those that lead to compliance?
Yes, well, observations, I think there are two stages in an improvement process where observations are really important. And
Mm,
one is at the stage of we've got a student outcome problem in terms of writing, let's say. So observations are needed for understanding how teachers are currently teaching writing, both the quality of it and the quantity of it. We've got, and you're observing the teachers of the students whose results you're worried about.
that's
So
right.
there's a tight connection there. So the way you do that in a respectful, trust building way is, first of all, at the first stage of problem solving, you get agreement that everyone is disappointed with the writing results. You
Right.
do not do anything until you have common ground around where both disappointed. Right. Then you explain why you don't want to improve anything in that teacher's practice until you understand why and how they're currently teaching writing. So that is being transparent about the purpose. It's the purpose is, first of all, to understand what they're currently doing, because you don't know what you need to improve until
Mm,
you've actually understood
mm.
how writing's currently being taught and
Yeah.
not taught.
Yeah.
Okay. Then you need to, when you've got the causal work done and you discover that the quantity of teaching writing is not good and the quality of it doesn't meet certain standards that you've learnt about, that's the knowledge in terms of their current practice, then you give them opportunities to learn from competent internal or external facilitator. And then your observations for the follow-up are, I'm observing because I want to know whether or not what we have agreed are the indicators of good practice are happening in your classroom yet. And if not, and what you're finding challenging, so that we can differentiate the professional learning and give you targeted support if needed.
Mhm.
So, two principles. One is absolute transparency of purpose, and the other is transparency around the indicators of practice that you're looking for after once the intervention starts. Then there is debriefing. Now, one of the things I'm saying to the New South Wales principals I'm coaching is nobody should be observing in classrooms unless they can be very explicit about the practices they are looking at and what their standard of good practice is, and that has been communicated and discussed during the professional learning.
Do you think if there are surprises around teacher observations that undermines relational trust? I mean, you talk extensively about that. Is that one of the things that we're trying to maintain by being really clear with what our expectations are?
Yeah, yes. The surprise observations. I mean, there are times when surprise observations have a place, but people need to know that there are going to be surprises.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I've had contexts where surprises need to happen because a particular group of teachers or teachers are practicing one way when the leader is present and differently when the leader is not present. So the observations are triggering some different practices which are not sustained when the leader's not present. Now the surprises needs to be discussed. That becomes the reason for surprise visits, and
Mm.
having discussed whether or not that is happening and why. So the compliance thing is, I don't know whether New South Wales leaders do this, but sometimes, certainly in the United States, there are mandates from district officers about how often principals need to go into classrooms. So the principal rocks up into the classroom and says, yeah, well, I have to do this and report on to the superintendent about this 3 times a term. So, now that's a compliance reason.
That's ticking boxes.
Yeah. As
Yeah.
opposed to the example I've been given, which is I'm here because we've agreed the writing results are disappointing. We've even talked about the fact you're not confident teaching about writing. So I want to come in sufficiently so we can get an agreed account of how you're currently teaching it and why not. And then we'll move on to doing something about it when we know the causes of the current writing difficulties.
Vivian, it would be amiss of me not to ask while you're here, how do we know if we're being successful? So there's a whole conversation around the evidence that we collect and assessments. What are some of the things that you think we should be looking at when we believe we've identified an issue, say, for example, in writing? Should we be collecting
Yeah.
work samples? What should that look like to get a cohesive idea of what's going on?
Well, in the fourth stage of my problem solving model, which is called collaborative complex problem solving, and I've written extensively about it in my latest book, Virtuous Educational Leadership. In that stage is about implementing a new strategy, implementing a new way of teaching writing. And at that stage, you actually have to identify indicators of progress. So those indicators of progress are, let's say that the facilitator has said there has to be so much, and you've agreed on the timetable, so much time spent explicitly teaching writing, and that involves teaching relevant vocabulary, and it involves teaching the structure of a paragraph, let's say. Okay? So those are your three indicators. So your measurement, if you're clear about what needs to be implemented, your measurement in terms of are the adults implementing the strategy, your measurement problem is solved because you know that you need to check somehow on the time being spent.
Right.
You need to check on the paragraph writing. And then, of course, you pick up the student's work.
Right. And I think it comes back to what you're saying before. There needs to be an agreed set of standards. This is what we're looking for. We've agreed that this is what we're looking for.
Yes.
And this is what good practice is. There should be no surprises. Yeah. Vivian, you talk a lot about, so you've mentioned, let me rephrase that, some of the work that you're doing with New South Wales in terms of building that leadership capacity and understanding. What's something which excites you about the direction that New South Wales is moving in? And maybe what also are some of the challenges that you can see from your perspective?
Well, what excites me is that we are potentially moving, not just in New South Wales, but other jurisdictions as well, from being a belief-based profession to an evidence-based profession. At the moment, teaching is a belief-based profession.
Right.
As a profession, I'm talking about. I mean, there might be, I'm not talking about any particular individual schools. And by that, I mean that it is still acceptable in many places for teachers to say, I'm passionate about, let's say, inquiry-based learning or play-based learning or whole language teaching of reading or whatever. I'm passionate about it. And I'm very confident and experienced, so I'll be teaching that way. So teaching according to the comfort levels and beliefs of teachers, of your teachers. Now, if those teachers are getting terrific results, then fine. But, that's your student-centered check. But your philosophy of how to teach should not be that relevant.
Right. Good point.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not about your philosophy of how to teach. And what I say to leaders is do not have philosophical debates with your staff about the teaching of reading. You'll be there forever. The reading wars are not quite over yet. And it's just fruitless. Just
Vivian,
focus on the results of your kids.
Sorry to interrupt, Vivian. What would be an example of a philosophical debate around reading?
Well,
there's many. Yeah,
phonics and whole language.
Right.
Okay, philosophical debate about how explicit teaching is going to drive out critical thinking or creativity.
Right.
Okay, or are we going to teach science by teaching kids how to behave like scientists? Okay.
I've heard all of those.
Yeah.
Too frequently. So then are you saying that is just a waste of energy? Like there's no point having those debates.
Yes.
How do we begin to reframe that then for making sure we're focusing on our students?
Well, for a leader, say, you could be right, you could be wrong, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that because, quite frankly, I don't think we'll resolve it. Let the academics have that debate. The move from a belief-based to an evidence-based profession is teachers
Mm.
who are utterly convinced that their way of teaching is the right way. You don't fight with them about it. You say, you could be right, you could be wrong. What we need to do is look at the evidence. And the evidence
Oh, I love
is
that.
the evidence of kids in your classroom.
I love that. And
Okay?
what do we do though? Like, I think this is so important because teaching is one of those professions where it is has formed so much of our identity. And for people that have been teaching for a long
Yes.
period of time, it's
Yeah.
hard to shift those. So what do we do when we come up to challenge, when we figure out that evidence actually challenges some of those core beliefs? What are some of the conversations we should have?
Well, the conversation needs to start with, I mean, why are you having the conversation? You're having a conversation because you both agree that the writing results are disappointing. You both agree that there's a plateau in comprehension
Love
between
that.
year 3 and 5.
Yeah.
That's what being student-centered gives you. It gives you common ground. We're both dissatisfied. That is a very powerful form of common ground. Shared dissatisfaction.
I think that's empowering, isn't it?
It is. And it doesn't matter if you have completely different views about the causes of those disappointing results. You're going to sort that out through your causal inquiry.
I love that. Yeah.
And that starts with getting all the beliefs of teachers about the writing results. They're all on the whiteboard, all of them. And then you you rule out all those that the school can't leverage. And then the plausible ones you then go away and test. Do not adopt any new strategies until you have completed the validation of your causal beliefs. So
Sounds good.
interrupting the quick fix is probably one of the hardest things for leaders to do, because sometimes part of their leadership as identity is I solve problems. When teachers ask me to jump, I jump. So, that's the quick fix.
Mm.
That's
That's it's so important, Vivian. But you write extensively about the emotional complexity of leadership. How do you think school leaders should deal with ambivalence in teams rather than trying to eliminate it? Because we've all got those people in our team that just don't want to shift their perspective. Do you have any advice on that?
again, again, they don't want to shift their perspective about what and why should they shift it?
Great point.
Because the results of the students for whom they are responsible,
Mm,
so, are not good enough. And I don't do anything until we have agreement that those results are disappointing. Okay. So don't start by thinking about them as resistors or blockers. What is the purpose of unblocking them?
that's a great point. And I love how you focus on the students in their care. I mean, we tend to
Yes.
talk about students in the school or in the state,
No.
but
Yeah.
we're not
Yeah.
explicitly responsible for students in the state, are
Yes.
we? Yeah.
No. So let's say you've got um, a member of the senior leadership team who is responsible for the maths and science departments, and those results are particularly problematic. And you think that team member's instructional leadership is weak, and that you see a connection between those. Well, you start with the results in that leader's area of responsibility. And you go through the process of, does that leader think that the results are not where they should be? Then you ask about why, and that leader's probably going to blame the teachers and in the science and maths departments, etc. And then you just and then the leader has to have sufficient courage to say, yep, all of those are possible, and we're going to test them, or at least test those that we can leverage. But there's nothing in there that you've said. I need to be frank and say that I don't think your leadership of science and maths from an instructional point of view is strong enough. Now, that's where leadership courage comes in, because there's no
Yeah.
point working with there's no point testing causes when you know privately that one of the most important causes is not on the list.
That's a
That's a
that's
biased sample.
That's such a great point, Vivian. And like I said, my hope is that people would listen to this conversation, whether they be school leaders or teachers, and it would start to raise some questions. And my
Yeah.
hope is that they would get a copy of your book or your books and really do a deep dive. And as I mentioned, one of the things that I really resonate with your work is just how practical it is. I mean, you've taken these really complicated issues. You know what schools are like.
Mm.
You have extensive experience with schools. You know how hard they are, but you give us some practical things that we can do in our classrooms and in our leadership teams to really make sure students are placed first and foremost. And I thank you for that. And final question, Vivian, if you don't mind. If you could choose one leadership practice that consistently improves outcomes for students, what would that be?
I think what I would advocate for the strongest is really helping leaders have learning focused conversations
Mm,
about the relationship between a teacher's practice and student outcomes. So it's not a punitive conversation, but it is a conversation where leaders are able to raise the hypothesis that the teaching of writing is not strong enough and that that's connected to the writing results and that's what needs to be checked or tested.
mm,
So how to have those conversations quickly, not taking 6 months to get the courage to actually do it, but to get that teacher on board. We agree the writing results are disappointing, and the leader being able to say within 5 minutes, yep, that's all possible, but you haven't mentioned the way you're teaching writing.
I love that. Professor Viviane Robinson, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to get to connect with you again, and I can't thank you enough for what you're investing into our wonderful profession. We really need it. So thank you so much for having a conversation with me.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.